First off is lighting. You do not need to grow lights for plant starts. These are regular shop light LEDs off of Amazon, or standard fluorescents work great too. The most important thing is the brightness of the light, which is referred to as the lumens. Now it turns out the sun is really bright and we need something really bright too. My lights are 4100 lumens, which I would consider the lowest brightness that's sufficient for growing. And as you can see, I have 2 of them on each shelf, so each row is getting 8200 lumens of light. If you don't have enough light, when the plants start growing, they're gonna reach for the light that is there, and that causes leggy seedlings. Leggy seedlings never really grow and eventually just plop over, but having enough light will prevent this. As important as having enough light is having the light provide enough coverage. The plants will grow leaning towards the light, and we want our plants to grow up, which means the light needs to be coming down and not from the side. So placing your lights with proper spacing is important to make sure the outer edges are getting enough light too. You want the light evenly spread out, so it's kind of showering the plants. Your plants will tell you this because if they are leaning in on one side, then you know that side may not be as bright as it needs to be, and you can work on the lighting placement to hone it in as best as your setup allows. Also, don't be afraid to put your lights pretty close to your starting trays. The extra heat that the light provides and also that intense brightness will help them as they start growing, and you can just move them up as you need to. Next up is soil. Over time, I've simplified this and removed anything that doesn't provide a big enough benefit, so this has left me with a mix that is only peat moss. You could also use cocoa coir, but I prefer peat moss. Lots of people will add things like vermiculite or perlite, but I just have not seen the benefit of this for seed starts, and both are added costs that I just don't think are really necessary. Vermiculite is primarily used in a lot of mixes because it retains water like a sponge. It can help keep the soil moist. Perlite looks the same, but is primarily used to prevent soil compaction since it stays hard. It also keeps pockets for air and water to permeate through so that your soil doesn't get compacted. Now, I've used both ingredients and I've also used neither of them, and can very confidently say that these added components are not necessary to a seed starting mix. The whole point of using peat moss is its ability to take up and hold water, so I don't think it needs any help in that department, and I can't think of a way that soil would be compacted in a tiny little pot. But if you think otherwise and would like to spend the additional money, then absolutely do it. But from my point of view, it's more of a cherry on top to a good soil mix and not necessary to growing large, healthy plant starts. You also want to avoid any potting mixes because they're going to have large pieces of twigs and bark that are not broken down yet, and that really impacts tiny seedlings as they're starting to poke through the soil. You could sift that out, but why bother? Just get some peat moss or coconut coir. It's worth it and lasts a very long time. So when it comes to watering, I prefer to bottom water only. As I mentioned, peat moss has an incredible ability to soak up water and will soak up literally an entire tray of water in almost no time. The benefit to bottom watering is you help reduce fungus gnats and also help prevent damping off, which is a fungus that kills baby plants. It's caused by too much moisture at the soil level up against the stem. Some plants like beets and spinach are particularly susceptible to this, and bottom watering really helps prevent that. I usually do about a ½ inch of water at the bottom, and if the water's gone and your pots are still dry, then you know they need some more. Now that your plant buddies are growing, they need some nutrients. Peat moss is completely void of any nutrients and is really considered just a growing medium, not a living and active soil. Plant starts need to be fertilized in order to grow, and I opt for a synthetic fertilizer for this. I am completely sold out to natural and organic gardening. I have multiple compost setups and only use organic inputs in my garden outside, and recommend you do the same. But organic gardening relies on a healthy soil structure, bacteria, funguses, and bugs to turn those organic inputs into actual nutrients for the plants. A peat moss mix doesn't have any of that. Organic fertilizers also take time to break down, and when I'm starting plants, I don't really have weeks or months for that to happen. Synthetic fertilizers offer macro and some micronutrients that are immediately available to your plants so they can get the nutrients they need to grow. Of course, if you want to do everything organically, you absolutely can, but this is an area of my gardening that I'm willing to bend on and use a synthetic fertilizer where I can get a really strong, healthy plant start and then transfer them to an organic environment to grow out in the garden. So when I fertilize, I usually use about 1/4 of the amount that is listed on the label for plant starts. You want to make sure it's diluted and then bottom water and let that soak up into the pots or trays. I end up fertilizing about every 10 to 14 days with this diluted mix, and if you keep it diluted, you're probably not going to over fertilize, so just keep it diluted and you should be good to go. Lastly, temperature can be really hard to solve for, and if you're starting plants in the early spring, it can be really difficult to get summer plants like peppers or tomatoes going. A heat mat can be beneficial for that, or using a clear plastic covering will create kind of a mini greenhouse effect to retain some heat. The best thing you can do is to try and get the lights as close to the seedlings as possible to share some of that heat, but you really just need to be patient and realize that summer veggies need that warmer temperature, and you can get as creative as you want to make that happen. It's pretty amazing how quickly you can run out of space, so I switched to this 72 cell tray from the Bootstrap Farmer. I love them, and with these I have enough space to start pretty much everything inside, which makes planting so much nicer out in my beds. Otherwise, I use these 3-inch pots, which are nice for things like cabbage or broccoli or tomatoes that grow a little broader. When I pot my plants, I usually grab a wheelbarrow and fill my trays inside of it, but a tabletop will also do just fine and make for an easy cleanup. I always pre-moisten the peat moss, otherwise it starts out really hydrophobic and will repel water for a few minutes. If you use a dry mix like that, their water will bounce off of it, and sometimes the seeds will actually fall out of the tray because the water will carry them away, and you obviously don't want that. Once the tray is filled, I will water it down and let the peat moss settle in, then I add my seeds. Make sure they're covered sufficiently and do one more gentle watering, then they get put underneath the lights. One last thing before you bounce, I have a fan which I rotate around because in a garage like this, there's no wind, which is a bad thing. A fan helps the surface stay dry and also prevents the previously mentioned gnats and damping off. Equally as important, it causes the plant to stiffen up its stem by providing some resistance to it. Consider it plant weightlifting, and doing so will give you stronger and healthier plants that will thrive once they're out in the garden. So what does something like this setup cost? You can get 12 lights on Amazon for around $80. This wire mesh rack, which I don't love, but it works, they're around $100 or so. If I were to do it again, I'd make one out of wood, but that's for another video. And then the pots, trays, and miscellaneous items are going to cost you somewhere around $100 or so. But these are all one-time investments, and if you have a big garden like me and were to buy plants from a nursery, you're going to be spending many times that every single season, so making the initial investment is well worth it. So if you've had problems with indoor plant starts, consider trying these methods and start there and make changes as you need to. And as always, make sure to state your displeasure in the comment section, being as rude as possible. Thank you, and God bless.